Well, it's the best day of the week. Again, Friday's the best day of the week for a lot of people, I think. And it's definitely the best day of the week for me because it's the day we do our Morning Pitt Mailbag. And we have lots of great questions this week. We have a couple questions to catch up on from last week, and then we got a bunch of questions, new ones that came in this week. Remember, if you want to be part of the Morning Pitt Mailbag, which we do every Friday here on the Morning Pitt on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com, you can submit your questions right there at Panther-Lair.com. Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com to get all of your Pitt sports coverage and the message boards where not only can you have conversations with other Pitt fans and read our content and talk about it and interact all day, every day, literally all day long, but you can also submit questions for the mailbag. Every Tuesday we put up a post saying, hey, you got questions about Pitt football or basketball or recruiting? Post them here. Lots of people do. We answer as many as we can on the mailbag. Let's not waste any more time. We'll jump into it right now. The Morning Pitt Mailbag here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Yeah, it's the Morning Pitt Mailbag here on the Friday edition of the Morning Pitt, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. You know what we always ask you to do? Like this video and subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. The subscribe button's right down there. That way you won't miss any of our exclusive Pitt video content. We've had a ton of video content out of training camp so far. Practice highlights, interviews, press conferences, all of those things, plus our daily Morning Pitt videos that we're doing right here. Our weekly live show that we do every Wednesday night at 8:30. You don't want to miss any of that stuff. So you should make sure you subscribe, and you can hang out and catch it all right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. I want to jump into the questions because we have a lot of good ones this week. I want to get as many as we can. One quick note, and I want to point this out because someone mentioned this. We record these Morning Pitt Mailbags. Obviously, we release them Friday morning. We record them usually Thursday afternoon or Thursday night. So if you happen to post a question in the thread and you post it on at Thursday night at 9 o'clock, we're probably not going to get to it. Chances are we already recorded the mailbag, and so we're not going to answer that question. It's not because we didn't want your question. It's not because we ignored it. We shouldn't, it didn't come in time. It did by the time we went to press, I guess, as they would say. But if we miss it that week, we'll get it the next week. And so that's what we're doing here this week. We're starting off with a couple questions that came in after we recorded. And A.S. Daniels had the first one and said, if people are starting to feel bullish, what is the bullish number, 8, 9, or 10? I see a really solid offensive line that will allow the offense to flourish. On defense, the D-backs, safeties, and linebackers may be the deepest three combined ever for Narduzzi. That allows the defensive line time to gel. Yeah, there are unknowns, but those will become knowns. I'm going 9. I think they're hungry, ready to eat. What will you put down on your bullish prediction? So I've said a couple times, and I think I'll stick with this, that I'm predicting this to be an 8-win team, like an 8-5 team. Either a 7-5 team in the regular season that wins a bowl game against like an Eastern Michigan to get to 8-5, or an 8-4 team in the regular season that loses a bowl game to another power conference opponent like a Northwestern or a Stanford. I mean, not Stanford because they're now in the ACC, but you know what I'm talking about. That sort of level of opponent. And they fall to 8-5. That's becoming my prediction, not because I necessarily think anything special about this team. It's not like all of a sudden I'm like, man, I think they're going to be a lot better than people think. I just think it's where they're going to end up. I think they're good enough to reach that level. And as I've often said, I think eight wins is sort of a baseline of a successful season. I think if you get under 8 wins in any given season, including the bowl game, it's not really successful. You go 7-6, yeah. You go 6-6. Obviously, no, that's not a good season. 6-7 or something like that. But then you push above. If you can get above 8 wins, if you can get to 9 wins or 10 wins, then you had a really good season. 8 wins is kind of that baseline good season. Fine season, and certainly a good bounce back from a 3-9 season. So that's where I'm ending up on my predictions. If you're starting to feel bullish about this team, if you're starting to think, hey man, these linebackers, maybe these D tackles be as good as Chris thinks they will. If you're thinking like, hey, you know what? I actually think these receivers and running backs who have experience in this offense, they'll be able to actually make plays. I think the offensive scheme will work. Nate Yarnell will get the ball to those guys, and they'll make plays. I'm getting bullish. I think you start talking about like 9 wins. I think that would be the bullish prediction. I would say if you're starting to warm on this team, then maybe you can predict 9. I'm going to probably stick with 8. I'm not really sure what I would see over the next couple of weeks that would lead me to change that prediction. I think I'm going to stick with 8 wins. which again would be a nice bounce back from 3-9. Potter County native says, who is the one player that Pitt cannot afford to lose this year for the season for whatever reason? That's a tough question. It's a tough question because you have to think about what you're asking. Like, there's no single guy you would look at and you're like, if they lose him, they're toast. Because ultimately what we're talking about, what you're asking is, who's the player where there's the greatest drop-off from starter to the backup? I think if you talk about 2021, right, you would say probably from Kenny Pickett to Nick Patty was probably the biggest drop-off on the team. Although maybe you could find an offensive line position where there was a significant drop-off. Certainly Jordan Addison to whoever would replace him would be a significant drop-off. Maybe one of the safeties, maybe Brandon Hill or Eric Hallett. But to say on this year's team that there's one guy that they just cannot afford to lose, I mean, I guess you would start like this. Who would you say are some of the best players on this team, right? If you would say, well, Donovan McMillan's one of the best players on this team. Okay. Behind him, he's got P.J. O'Brien, Cruz Brookins, and Jesse Anderson. Well, I don't know if any of those guys are going to be able to play at the level that I expect Donovan McMillan to play this season, but they're all good players. There's a drop-off, but I'm not sure how significant or severe it is. If you want to say, Panthers mentioned Kyle Lewis yesterday. Say Kyle Lewis is one of the top 3 players on defense so far in training camp. Okay. Well, the backup there is probably like a Jordan Bass or Rasheem Biles or Braylon Lovelace. Like, yeah, I think I think Lewis is going to be really, really good, but I think those other guys are good too. Offensively is where it gets interesting. I think you could look at like the tackles. You could look at like Ryan Baer. I think Ryan Baer is going to be really good this year. Is Isaiah Montgomery, who I think is the backup right tackle, how significant is that drop off from Baer to Montgomery? There's a pretty decent drop off there. So that might be one. Maybe Gavin Bartholomew, who pops up on the screen conveniently just as we're saying this. How far is that drop off from Gavin Bartholomew to the next tight end, whether it's Jake Renda or Jake Overman or someone else named Jake that I haven't thought of yet? It's probably pretty severe, probably pretty considerable, but is it so great? Is the drop off so great that we say, boy, Pitt can just not afford to lose that guy? I'm not sure there's one. Ben Sauls? I'm not sure if there's really a guy that they just cannot afford to lose. You say Kenny Johnson, well, they got Konate Munfield. You say Konate Munfield, well, they got Kenny Johnson. You say Rodney Hammond, well, they got Desmond Reed and Derek Davis. You say Nate Yarnell, they got Eli Holstein, who's in competition with him. You say Terrence Moore, well, he's in competition with Lyndon Cooper. Maybe one of the guards. Maybe there's a significant drop-off there. So I don't really see like an obvious answer. Maybe somebody else listening to this or watching this does have an obvious answer. Put it in the chat or put it on the message boards. But I don't see anybody who really stands out as like, oh man, they cannot afford to lose him. There could be bad injuries. There could be key players they're counting on. If they lose him for the season, that's a problem, and certainly if those start to add up, that's a big problem. But right now, I don't know if I see that one guy like you're talking about that is, boy, they just cannot afford to lose him. I'll have to think about it. Maybe, let me know if you have somebody in mind, Potter County native. I think that's who asked this question, right? Potter County native. Yeah, if you have somebody in mind, post it. I'd like to hear what you think because nothing really jumps out to me. Big Show 2000 says early in camp still, so probably TBD, but who are some of the guys who look like they're going to be a good fit for the Delta package? That's an interesting question. Let's have a quick review of what the Delta defensive package is. Panarduzzi has used this since he got to Pitt. I think he probably used it at Michigan State as well. It's their third down defensive package, obvious passing down kind of defensive package. They probably wouldn't use it on 3rd and 2, 3rd and 3, maybe 3rd and 4. I think once you get past that to 3rd and 5 or greater, they're definitely going to bring it out there. And so they like to use it on passing downs. It's a little bit like a nickel, but it's not really a nickel. Because instead of removing a linebacker and bringing in an extra cornerback, they remove a defensive lineman and have typically brought in an extra safety. And we'll get to that extra DB in a second. So they go with 3 down linemen, typically 2 ends and a tackle. Although there have been times where we've seen like an end like Patrick Jones or Rashad Weaver line up at that middle in the middle of that three-man line. They go with three linebackers. Sometimes the linebackers they had on the field, sometimes they'll swap out. They have certain guys they like to play in certain situations. They'll keep their regular corners and safeties, and then they'll bring in an extra player. A lot of times that's been an extra safety. I think in 2021 they brought in John Patrician to play that role because he had been a safety. Who kind of grew into a linebacker. They actually call that position the star. It's the star position in the Delta defense. The star in the base defense is an outside linebacker. It plays at the wide side of the field. So I think that gives some insight on how they think of that position. It's not really a nickel back, even though they'll sometimes sort of colloquially refer to it as a nickel. It's not really a nickel back. It's almost more of like a 3-4 linebacker kind of look. I often say that it's got the personnel of a 3-3-5 because it's typically an extra defensive back who comes in, usually a safety. It's got the personnel of a 3-3-5, but it kind of acts a little bit like a 3-4. And that's my own layman's way of looking at it. A real football coach, certainly Pat Narduzzi would say, you're an idiot. That's not it at all. That's how I kind of see it. That's how I describe it. Which players seem like they would be a good fit? Now, that's an interesting question. One of the linebacker spots, I guess what is probably considered the money linebacker, typically playing to the boundary in the Delta defense, often is a pass rusher. And we've seen guys like Chase Pine play in that role. I think we've seen like Phil Campbell and Cam Bright play in that role. It's an effective role. It's one that blitzes a lot. It really gets after the quarterback. It looks like a fun position to play, to be quite honest. I could see one of these guys like Rasheem Biles or Jordan Bass lining up there and being in that rush off the edge type of position. Maybe Key Thompson said he's been getting some work in the Delta defense, although I think he'd probably be more in like a middle linebacker type of spot. What will be interesting too to see is how they personnel that or what personnel they use for the defensive line. If they want to throw like Sean Fitzsimmons in the middle, if they want to get a little more athletic, a guy like Isaiah Neal in the middle, if they want to take like a guy like, they don't really have like a bigger D end who could really play there. I mean, I think Nate Matlack will be one of the defensive ends. I'm guessing you'll have a defensive tackle in the middle. They usually didn't go with that sort of run stuffing defensive tackle on those plays because they weren't typically facing a run. They wanted somebody who could kind of pass rush up the middle, especially if they tried to blitz a couple linebackers up the middle too, which they often like to do. And so I could see like a Fitzsimmons or a Neal playing there, maybe Nick James, depending on how he evolves. That extra position, though, that extra DB is going to be really interesting to watch. I think they've got a lot of good options there. Rashad Battle has played in that role before earlier in his career. They've got obviously all these safeties. You know what I mean? If you want to stick with, McMillan and McIntyre, and you want to bring in PJ O'Brien to be that spot, you want to bring in Cruz Brookins to be that spot, you want to bring in Jesse Anderson to play that spot, I think they all would be good options to play that star role in the Delta defense where they could be that extra defensive back. So they've got a lot of possibilities here. I think they got a lot of ways they can go about it. I think it was last year they actually, whatever two corners they had, they would move Marquez Williams into that spot. And he effectively lined up as like a slot corner, and they would bring in the third corner, whether it was MJ Devonshire or AJ Woods, or sometimes they would put AJ in the star role, whatever it may be. They went with three corners, even though they still worked it like their Delta defense. We have seen Pitt in the past under Narduzzi a couple times. I feel like this only happened at Syracuse a couple times for whatever reason, but they went with like a more traditional nickel package of 4 down linemen, 2 linebackers, and an extra corner. I remember Theron Coleman doing that one year. It might have been 2017, maybe. I don't remember exactly when that was, but I do remember like, oh, they're playing a real nickel package, a 4-2-5 nickel package, but more often than not, that Delta defense is that 3-3-5 look, kind of works like a 3-4, and I think they got a lot of good options on who they can play in that group this year. I like this question a lot. 121 Rome says, which transfer has a bigger impact for their respective team this season, Cam Corrin or Nate Matlack? So usually I'll look over these questions earlier in the day, before we record, just is there anything I need to look up? Is there anything I want to do some research? Or if somebody's like, hey, who's your top 5 this? I don't want to just do that off the top of my head. Or sometimes I do. and it's just as entertaining or just as fun that way. But if there's anything I want to research or look up or any stats I want to have handy for a particular question, I'll go through it and look ahead of time. And so I saw this question, and I thought about this question probably more than any other question, because I really went back and forth about like what I expect from Cam Corrin, what I expect from Nate Matlack, and what kind of impact I expect each of those guys to have with their teams. Like, I think Cam Corrin will be pretty good, but I think his pretty good might get overshadowed by really good from Jalen Lowe and Amsal Delalich, and I'm not getting off that train, by the way. You want to talk about hype trains? That's the one that's pulling out of the station. But, I mean, Cam Corrin's pretty good, might get overshadowed by really good from Lowe and Delalich and Damian Dunn and Ishmael Leggett and, who knows, Brandon Cummings. I think this Pitt basketball team is going to have a bunch of good players on it. And so I think Cam Corrin is a great addition. I think he's going to be really good. I'm just not sure if he's going to be, I don't know how his impact is going to stack up and measure up against some of the other guys on the team. Kind of the same way, somewhat similar. I think Nate Matlack is going to be pretty good for Pitt this year. I'm going into the season expecting him to lead the team in sacks, probably 7 or 8. I don't know if I think he'll get into double digits, but I think he'll get up there, 7.5, 8.5, something like that. I think that would be a pretty solid season for Nate Matlack. How that ends up impacting the team, that's tough to say. I guess I would probably predict Matlack, because I could see Cam Corrin making a real impact and averaging like 9 and 9 or something like that. You know what I mean? 9 and 8, 9 and 7.5 or so. And so we would look back at it and be like, wait, did that guy make a huge impact? No, Nate Matlack had 8.5 sacks. That's a bigger impact than Cam Corrin averaging 9 and 8 or 9 and 7.5 or whatever. So I guess I would lean toward Matlack, not because I don't think Corrin's going to make a positive impact on Pitt basketball this year, but just because I think he just might get overshadowed, because I think a lot of guys are going to make a positive impact, like all ACC first team selection Amsal Delalich. Hong Muncher says, are any of the new coaches standing out more than others now that we're a couple weeks into camp? Do any of them seem to be really connecting with the players? Have you heard any extraordinarily positive things? Thanks in advance and love the podcast. Well, thank you for listening. We appreciate you. I think Jacob Bernowski's done really well. I think the players have responded really well to him, both on tight ends and the special teams. And quite frankly, I hear more talk about him on the special team side than I do on the tight end side, which is interesting and not necessarily a bad thing. You can pretty much have as many coaches on the field as you want right now in practice. This is a new rule for this year. You're not limited to just your 10 assistants, the head coach, and the 4 GAs or whatever you have. You can put anybody on the field you want, and they've got a lot of people on the field. They have enough that if for some reason there was a period where the tight ends were working over there and the special teams were over there, Bronowski could be with the special teams and somebody else could handle the tight ends. Now, usually the tight ends are involved in the special teams anyway, so that doesn't happen very often. But most of what I've observed about Bronowski, most of what I've heard about Bronowski, most of what I've heard people talk about Bronowski, it's in relation to special teams. And there does seem to be something extra there. Not something that I can sit at practice and I can watch and be like, whoa, look at that. That is different. But it's just what people are saying and the impression you kind of get and the energy he's brought and how the players seem to be responding to him. So I think Jacob Bernowski is looking like a pretty good hire, so far at least. And I think the players have, I think they've enjoyed having him. I think the defensive line is responding well to Tim Doust, too. I think he was a really good hire. I know you're replacing one of the most respected coaches on the staff in Charlie Partridge, but I think Tim Doust was a pretty good hire and somebody that I think he'll do a good job. I think the players have responded well to him, and I think he's been coaching him well. So those two guys have really stood out to me. I talked to a bunch of the coaches at Media Day last week, and Lindsey Lamar impressed me. Smart guy, had some good stuff to say, some good insight on his running backs. It was interesting to talk to him. And so I can't really speak to how I think the running backs have enjoyed him and they've responded well to him. Rodney Hammond and Derek Davis, we interviewed those guys, and they both said really good things about him. It seems like they like that he's younger. Not necessarily that they're saying we like that he's younger than Andre Powell is, but they like that he's younger. They feel like he can connect with them a little bit better. And so it seems like that's going well too. But those are a few guys that come to mind that I would say seem like they've done a pretty good job. All right, last one here. H2P_JC says, you've talked a lot about the line, the linebackers, the safeties. What are you hearing about the corners? It sounds like Rylan Gandy's a lock, and I saw Tamon Lynam and Rashad Battle were mentioned recently. Any word on how Jeremiah Anglin and others are performing so far? Well, it seems like Rylan Gandy's, like you say, I mean, he's pretty much he's the guy at the top of the list. And then you've got a bunch of other guys that are sort of battling for that other starting job and the other two rotational spots. It's Rashad Battle, it's Tamarian Crumpley, it's Tamon Lynam, it's Jeremiah Anglin, it's Noah Bigelow, it's Shadarian Harrison, who is out there and looks big and long and athletic and probably somebody we should keep a closer eye on. Although he doesn't have a ton of experience because he was hurt last year and that slowed him up a little bit. I still think he's going to be a really good player. If I had to guess, if they started this season tomorrow, I think Rashad Battle would be the other starting corner. There would be Gandy and Battle with Lynam and somebody else in a rotation. I'm really not sure how the rotation would fill out beyond those guys. I think that's the top three, although there could be another guy who's in the top three and Lynam's actually like number 4. But I think if they started the season tomorrow, I think it would be Gandy and Battle as the starters. Those will be my predictions. And then some kind of rotation behind me. And I think those guys will be good. I really do. I'm really just kind of brushing off any concerns about the corners. I think they've recruited well enough there. I think they've got a strong enough track record of developing cornerbacks and defensive backs as a whole that until they fail, until they have a group that falls apart. And we've a bunch of times over the course of the summer, we've talked about sort of the lineage of corners under Pat Narduzzi since he got to Pitt and the lineage of safeties under Pat Narduzzi since he got to Pitt. And I'm really at a point where, like, until they fail, I'm not really going to get too worked up about it. So I think they'll have Gandy and Battle out there and a couple other guys. And I'm guessing they'll have them playing pretty well. Not too concerned there. Not as confident as I am about the safeties. Not as sort of, sky high ceiling optimistic as I am about the linebackers. Not even as sort of increasingly bullish as I am on the defensive tackles. I'm just sort of quietly and cautiously optimistic based on precedent when it comes to the cornerbacks. So great questions. We had a few left over we didn't get a chance to get to, but we're already over that 23-minute mark. Don't want to use all your good material in one episode, right? Come on. Show business. So we'll get to those next week. We already got a head start on next week's mailbag. Got a bunch of good questions, so can't wait to dive into those for next Friday. Make sure you like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. That way you don't miss any of our Pitt video content. These daily morning Pitt videos, our weekly live show every Wednesday night, and all kinds of video content coming out of training camp. So like and subscribe. Make sure you check out the website, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. Thanks so much for tuning in today. Thanks so much for tuning in this week. I hope you have a great Friday and a great weekend, and we'll catch up with you on Monday. Here on YouTube, we'll catch up with you on Monday. We'll have lots of coverage at Panther-Lair.com throughout the weekend, and then we'll get you with another Morning Pitt Monday morning right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.